Well, here's something that New York football fans like myself don't usually get to say. It's playoff time. And it doesn't matter how good your NFL team is, your fantasy team is all that matters to us. Welcome to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM, the sportsbook born in Vegas. We have your special Tuesday waiver wire edition. We'll tell you if you should prioritize Patrick Taylor versus Tank Bigsby versus Adam Thielen. Maybe get yourself a quarterback off the waiver wire. We'll look at the entire list. I'm Adam Azer with Jamie Eisenberg and Dave Richard. What's up, Jamie? Successful season for you? You ready for some playoff football?
Yes, it was a successful season so far. Hopefully it'll be successful in a few weeks. And listen, New York fans are thrilled. They got Juan Soto to the Mets.
Why'd you have to go there? Why did you have to go there? Well, yeah, some New York fans are thrilled. Dave Richard, I know it's been a good year for you as well, and you're ready to get into the waiver wire. But before we do that, I'm going to throw it to you for our first big topic. I want you to give me some big fantasy takeaways from last night's game, the Cowboys and the Bengals. A pretty solid game.
Yeah.
I think we should just talk about the Simpsons version. What did you think of that?
I thought it was fun. It was definitely clever, and it's amazing how far technology has come. Remember when it was a big deal for an NFL game just to have the yellow first down line on the screen? Yeah. Now we've got Simpsons characters throwing touchdowns to each other. The punt botch at the end of the game was also something that was kind of fun to see. Listen, Dallas's offense, not a disaster, and that's probably good news for fantasy managers who are hoping to continue to get something from Rico Dowdle. I think you will. CeeDee Lamb, great first quarter, kind of worked his way through the rest of the game with that shoulder injury. Hopefully that doesn't keep him out from our fantasy matchups in week 15 and beyond. But it's good to see those two guys, Lamb and Dowdle, put up good numbers in a favorable matchup. There will be more of those for the Cowboys moving forward.
Yeah, Jamie, anything for you? How about T. Higgins? Are you going to be at all scared to put T. Higgins back in your lineup?
Not at all. He's been so solid for the majority of the season. I know that there's this push from Joe Burrow to get Jamar Chase the triple crown of catches, yards, and touchdowns from a receiver, but T. Higgins is just still so special, and this matchup against Tennessee is nothing to be worried about, especially with their secondary being as beat up as it has been. So he's a number one wide receiver rest of way, at least a number two receiver, top 20 guy for sure.
You guys think Chase Brown will be a first-round pick next season?
Ooh, probably not a first-round pick. And I'm not even sure that he'll be alone in that backfield next year like he was in the second half of this year. So we might be talking about Chase Brown as like round 3, round 4.
He'll be a round 2 pick for me for sure.
Even if the Bengals add somebody, Jamie? See, I'm worried that the Bengals are going to go and add
I don't really worry
somebody.
about what they're going to do. He's proven himself. He's a number 2 running back.
I hope they agree with you. I love watching him play.
19 or more PPR fantasy points in 5 straight games for Chase Brown. And if you have Rico Dowdle, Dave talked about him, you got a good matchup this week, someone you can probably have confidence in your fantasy playoffs. So if you don't have Rico Dowdle, if you don't have a good running back, you might have a starting running back for the 49ers for Thursday's game against the Rams. That's always a good thing. But let's get our top 3 waiver wire priorities. And we'll start with you, Jamie. Who are the top 3 this week?
Yeah, Adam Thielen is number 1. You look at what he's done the last 2 games, 17 catches. He's been an absolute stud with Bryce Young. And it's a very good matchup against a Dallas defense that's once again beat up and struggling. We saw what the number 1 receiver for the Bengals just did. Obviously, you don't expect Adam Thielen to be Jamar Chase, but he's put up Jamar Chase-like numbers in the past 2 games. So Adam Thielen is number 1 for me. And then it's a combination of whatever running back you think is going to be the best, not just for next week, for this week, but also moving forward. So for 1 week, Patrick Taylor does make more sense, let's say, than Tank Bigsby. But Bigsby, if we find out that Isaac Guerendo practices, then Bigsby will be the number 1 running back to add. It's just not expected to be a long-term injury for Isaac Guerendo, so I don't think you want to go all in on Patrick Taylor unless, of course, you're stuck. It's not a bad matchup against the Rams this week, so hopefully Taylor is the featured guy for the 49ers. He is the next man up without McCaffrey, Mason, and now Guerendo dealing with injuries.
And how about you, Dave? Who are your top 3?
My top 3, just in a vacuum, Taylor's going to be number 1. I want to have those running backs that are going to get a lot of work, especially in an offense like the 49ers, in a good situation for him. He's got fresh legs, taking on a Rams defense on a short week. Man, this should set up for Patrick Taylor to have a pretty good game. But if you think about Adam Thielen, and let's just say you need a flex play for this week, I think Thielen in full PPR does make more sense than Taylor, but that's only if you need somebody like that this week, or if you just need a wide receiver in general. You want to add that type of player to your bench. Thielen makes sense. So it's a little bit of what you need, but in the vacuum, like I said, it's Taylor 1, it's Thielen 2, and then Hunter Henry is still out there in about 40% of CBS Sports leagues. He would be third for me. You could always use a good PPR tight end.
Let me throw the Ravens DST into the fray here. They're available. Adam Thielen is available. Taylor is available. Jamie, who's your number one priority now?
I think it just depends on what you're looking at, for what your team needs. You also want to take a look at what your opponent has and maybe decide if he's going to be better for you to play defense and keep one of those receivers or running backs away from your opponent, and then maybe pivot to the Commanders, who also have a good matchup this week, or even the Falcons. I know that seems strange to say, but they have a good upcoming schedule for the next 2 games, and their pass rush has been there. The Ravens, though, could win you your week easily by comparison to those other 2 particular options, because Thielen can go back to being a 31-year-old wide receiver, and obviously Patrick Taylor may not even be the starting running back for the 49ers for this week. So the setup for the Ravens defense, taking on the Giants, down another, down offensive lineman, banged up Drew Luck, inconsistent and potentially hurt, Tommy DeVito. This could be a bloodbath for the Ravens, and they could be one of the best scoring units. Forget about DSTs, units across the board for Week 15.
And I want to throw out another name. We had a long podcast this morning. We didn't mention Kaimi Fairbairn. I think he's about 80% rostered. Kicker for the Texans. People dropped him during the bye week. Take a look. I saw he was available in 2 of my leagues. I put in claims for him in both of those leagues, but this guy is one of the best kickers in fantasy. So the Broncos DST has been dropped. The Ravens DST is available in a lot of leagues. Even the Cardinals DST is 69% roster, but Kaimi Fairbairn is one of those guys that is a must roster player that you might be able to get because he was dropped during his bye week. All right, I got 2 more questions for you before we really break down the waiver wire. Player that you've gained trust in going into the fantasy playoffs. We'll start with that. Dave, give me a player that you're more trusting now to put in your lineup when it counts the most.
I am drawing a blank on who I sent you. Do you remember who I sent you?
I don't think you sent me anybody, or I would have sent you.
Okay, how about Jordan Addison then? I'm just going to go with Jordan Addison as the guy that, and listen, he really should have been top of mind for me. The fact that I forgot is totally embarrassing. I apologize for that. But Jordan Addison has really stepped up over the past few weeks, and I think you can look at him. We used to look at him as like a boom or bust number 3 type of fantasy receiver. Not anymore. That offense is too good. His matchup against Chicago this week is outstanding. I think you could still start Jordan Addison as a number 3 if you want to, but have number 2 wide receiver expectations.
Jamie, I have no idea who you were going to say. Who are you gaining trust in?
Yeah, no, I remember mine. It's Anthony Richardson. 25 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. And, I think we just have seen the confidence in him. And hopefully his receivers can step up. Hopefully Josh Downs is able to play in this matchup against Denver. But think about what we saw the last time the Broncos were on the field. It was an embarrassment for them as Jameis Winston threw for nearly 500 yards, 4 touchdowns. He did have the 3 interceptions, but that's on Jameis. I think with the way that Richardson is playing since he's been benched, we never expected to have Anthony Richardson again as it even considering him as a fantasy option after he was replaced by Joe Flacco. And now he may end up being a league winner. So the schedule sets up favorably. This is a questionable matchup, so you just have to keep that in mind and comparing him to who else you have in terms of who your starting quarterback may be. But based on the Broncos defense, if they're still banged up coming out of their bye week, if he can avoid making mistakes a la Jameis Winston, he's going to have an opportunity here to use his legs, 6.1 fantasy points or more in 3 straight games with just his rushing totals alone. He can get to 20-plus fantasy points and be a low-end starter, and then maybe, again, difference maker in the final 2 games based on the schedule.
Yeah, I'm going to add a name here just because something really interesting that Jacob Gibbs said on Beyond the Box Score yesterday. He talked about if you can predict when the Dolphins wide receivers will be more involved. And what he's going to be looking at is man versus zone coverage. When they play teams that play a lot of zone, you're going to see more of Jonnu Smith, Devon Achane. When they play teams that play less zone, that just aren't extremely zone heavy, you're probably going to see more from Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Their schedule is a little bit more man heavy going forward. They had gotten through a stretch of teams that play a lot of zone. So I am hopeful. He's not in the same category as Jordan Addison. I'd rather start Addison, but I am hopeful for Jalen Waddle to be someone that I can play with confidence in the fantasy playoffs. Jamie, how about a player you're losing faith in going into the fantasy playoffs?
I mean, I just finished writing the waiver wire column for Week 15, and it was very difficult to not put Deebo Samuel as a drop. Like, that's how bad it's gotten for him right now. So, this was a guy that was drafted to be a must-start wide receiver. He's complaining about his lack of targets, so who knows what's going on in that building. We know Jawan Jennings has certainly stepped up and been a better fantasy option, real-life option, just everything better than Deebo Samuel lately. And George Kittle, whoever the running back is, going to be more involved than Deebo at this point. So he's not getting the production on the ground. He's only got 2 touchdowns on the season, 1 receiving, 1 rushing. So he's not doing anything to help you from the dual threat aspect of things. Deebo Samuel has been one of the biggest busts this season, and there's no way you're starting him in the fantasy playoffs.
Okay, Dave, how about you? Who have you lost faith in?
And I remember the name, DK Metcalf. I wish I had forgotten the name. I wish I had forgotten to put him in my fantasy lineup in any of the last 4 weeks. In fact, since he's come back from being hurt, Adam, he has yet to put 15 PPR points on the board for anybody's fantasy team. He's not the same guy. I think it's injuries playing a role, along with Jackson Smith and Jigba becoming the number 1 option in that Seattle passing game. And on top of that, last week we saw Zach Charbonnet look outstanding for the Seattle offense on the ground and through the air. I wonder if they continue to lean on Charbonnet, because now it's a calf injury for Kenneth Walker. Maybe they don't want to rush him back. They've got some games in January that they're hoping to play. They lean on Charbonnet. They lean on JSN. They take it easy with DK Metcalf. He is at best a number 3 fantasy receiver, if not on my fantasy bench, at least this week in Week 15, but it might be for the next 3 weeks.
Speaking of Zach Charbonnet, he will be featured in Who Has More coming up later in today's show. I tried, everybody. I tried to get rid of the waiver wire and just play Who Has More for an hour. They wouldn't let me do it. So when we come back, Anthony Richardson at the Broncos or Jameis Winston against the Chiefs, who's the better quarterback to pick up? We'll look at waiver wire quarterbacks and running backs after this on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back, everybody, to Fantasy Football Today. Who are the quarterbacks and running backs that you should be adding for Week 15 or maybe for Week 16 if you're not playing this week? Maybe you have a bye or just don't need anyone this week. You shouldn't just think about this week, and you shouldn't just think about your team. Please check your opponent's lineup, see who your opponent needs, and maybe you can play a little bit of defense. And just real quick, if you're going to be making fab bids, check how much fab everyone else in your league has, and only spend as much as you need to. Don't spend all of your fab if you don't have to. You might have $30 more than the next person in your league, so don't spend it all. Now, as we get to quarterbacks, Anthony Richardson is the headliner here. But, Jamie, look at his last 3 games. Fantastic games against the Jets and the Patriots. Really a lot of chances, but didn't come through against the Lions. Scored 13 points. This Broncos matchup on paper is tough. Are you expecting a good game from Anthony Richardson?
I am. I think you look at, again, this defense for the Broncos. We'll see what their injury report looks like, so that will determine just how potentially good Richardson can be. But he also had a lot of miscues in that game against New England, and I think he could have had an even bigger game. So 25 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. Like I said, he's running more lately. He's giving you at least 6.1 fantasy points with his rushing totals alone in this 3-game stretch since he's come back from being benched, with 3 rushing touchdowns over that span. So this Broncos defense is really good. This game has huge implications for the playoffs. The Colts need to win and give the Broncos a loss to hopefully get a wild card spot. They're right behind Denver in terms of being the 8th seed, while the Broncos are the 7th seed. So there's an opportunity here for Richardson to help the Colts get into the playoffs. I think the time off will certainly benefit him as well. So I do like his chances from a high-end standpoint, because when he's on, he's amazing. I think he could be a league winner for Fantasy Manager.
All right, Dave, what's your take on this list? Richardson versus Jameis Winston. I think it's, I would go with Richardson, but I think it's easy to make a case here for Jameis because he's struggled when he's faced Pittsburgh, but so did Lamar Jackson, you know what I mean? And he's been pretty good. Not just good, he's been great. And the Chiefs are really struggling defensively. So I like Jameis this week. Do you like anyone? Do you like Jameis also? And do you like anyone else?
So why don't I amend what you said? I think Jameis is great for fantasy. I'm not sure if he's necessarily great for the Browns. I don't know if he's going to lead them to the playoffs next year if he stays under center for them. But he's great for fantasy, and I like his matchup against Kansas City better than Anthony Richardson. So if it's a 1-week deal, I'd rather have Jameis Winston, who I expect will continue continue throwing the ball a ton against against the Chiefs, excuse me. 4 of the last 6 quarterbacks to take on Kansas City have put up at least 20 fantasy points. Justin Herbert probably would have gotten there if Ladd McConkey were healthy on Sunday night. And so I think that there's just more upside for Winston. And he's got the same kind of downside, maybe a little bit more downside, because he doesn't run like Anthony Richardson does. But both of these quarterbacks are known for being hot and cold throwing the football. But one of them is going to throw it a heck of a lot more than the other one. And he's got the better matchup as far as fantasy points are concerned. They're going to be back-to-back in my rankings. Winston ahead of Richardson in Week 15.
Jamie, take us through the rest of the list. You got Aaron Rodgers, Cooper Rush, Drake May, Bryce Young. Maybe if you need a replacement in a 2QB league, we might get Mason Rudolph, although they seem to think Levis is okay. You might get Desmond Ridder. O'Connell hasn't been ruled out. And you have the Saints situation too. But who should we be looking at if we are in deeper leagues?
I mean, look, Cooper Rush has got a great matchup against the Panthers. We'll see if he can take advantage of it. He didn't really do what I was hoping for him to do against the Bengals, although he played well, but just not from a fantasy point perspective. Bryce Young's been fantastic, and the schedule coming up for him is really good as well. He gets the Cowboys this week and then the Bucs in Week 17. If you are looking at it more for Superflex and 2 quarterback leagues, we saw him have his best game maybe as a pro against the Bucs 2 games ago when he scored 25 fantasy points. Rodgers is an interesting spot just because he's been basically in that 18 to 20-point range for the better part of the last 6 games. He does have a fantastic matchup against Jacksonville. You talked about this on our podcast on Tuesday morning, that he's dealing with a variety of injuries, according to Jay Glazer. So we'll see if he's able to overcome them and maybe still have a struggling running game on top of that against the Jaguars defense. We know that is a struggle to stop the run. So if Breece Hall returns, or if it's the combination of Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis, they get going, maybe we don't see the high-end production from Rodgers, which, again, has been missing. But most of these guys, aside from Richardson and Winston, are more desperation plays. Hopefully don't need to rely on those guys. And then, as you mentioned, could be some options for Superflex and 2 quarterback leagues. If Levis is not healthy, the last time we saw Mason Rudolph, back-to-back games with 21 fantasy points, and clearly a great matchup taking on the Bengals in Week 15.
Dave, let's transition to the running backs here and take a look at some of the players. So you've got Patrick Taylor, and, who are some guys that you might consider starting him over this week? I asked you about Tyrone Tracy, for example, on FFT Express. So who are some guys that at least Patrick Taylor is in the same range, assuming Garendo's out this week?
I think in non-PPR, he's going to be in that range that you're talking about, the Tyrone Tracy, Ramondre Stevenson, Najee Harris range, a Jets running back, Isaiah Pacheco really hasn't come through like I thought he might have last week, and now I'm worried about just how much he's going to play this week. That's the range. This is a low-end number 2 fantasy running back range, and it's on the idea that Taylor will be the primary for the 49ers in a good matchup and a good situation. And look, he's not a super talented running back. He's, however you want to look at it, he was 4th or 5th on the depth chart to begin the year for this 49ers team. And because of injuries, now he's getting into a position where he can contribute. But they don't really have anybody else who's more talented than he is. There's Keyshawn Vaughn. There's Izzy Abanikanda. I kind of like Abanikanda, but I'm not sure if he's been with the team long enough to really know the details of what he needs to do. And this is a good run scheme. I think that you just have to trust Taylor to get 15 touches. He's physical enough to work his way in short yardage goal line situations, so he might score as well. He's an easy guy to go after if you picked up Garendo last week and you're not going to have Garendo available this week. And if you've been really upset with the production you've been getting from other running backs, you can pivot to Taylor, get him off the waiver wire, and use him this week as a low-end number 2 guy.
I have the 6th seed in a playoff matchup, so I am going to get Patrick Taylor, and I'm going to start him over the next guy on the list, Sincere McCormick, who's also, somewhat appealing to pick up in his own right. But, Jamie, we had a good Tank Bigsby. He might be the next guy on the list, or he might be number 1. Tank Bigsby versus Patrick Taylor debate between you and Dave on the podcast this morning. I thought it was a really interesting discussion. What side are you on if it's Bigsby versus Taylor that people can pick up?
So I think it depends on when you're making your waiver moves, which I would recommend, doing it Wednesday most weeks in your league. So if you want to change that setting for next season. But if it is Tuesday and you're doing it Tuesday night, just see what the practice report is for Isaac Garendo. If he does not practice at all, then Taylor should be the number 1 running back to add this week because his matchup is better for Week 15 than it is for Tank Bigsby against the Jets. I don't think will stop the Jaguars per se, even though that sounds funny. But I think just the Jets defense right now is pretty miserable. In any event, Bigsby long-term clearly has more upside because it does not appear to be a long-term injury for Garendo, so he could be back as early as week 16. And if that's the case, then Taylor goes to a more secondary role. Whereas what we saw from Bigsby against the Titans, not an easy matchup. He came through with 18 carries, scored a touchdown, and they have very competitive games rest of way. So it could be a situation where Bigsby, while sharing with Travis Etienne, still gets more carries, seems to have an opportunity to score a touchdown. Maybe we'll get a couple of catches. I think you probably want to limit your expectations for what his role will be in the passing game. But there is a chance here for Bigsby to potentially help your fantasy team down the stretch more so than Patrick Taylor. So for 1 week, Taylor probably has the edge. The rest of season, Bigsby has the edge. Just depends on what you're looking at. So if you have a bye this week and you're deciding between 2 running backs, I would choose Bigsby over Taylor because by next week, Bigsby may be starting and Taylor may just be somebody you want to stash on your team.
All right, we're going to finish this segment with a fun little game. I'm going to give you a name, and you can give me a 10 to 15 second sales pitch for picking up this guy. Here we go. Ready? Jamie Sincere McCormick.
Got over 15 total touches last week. Not the worst matchup against the Falcons. They don't give up a lot of touchdowns. They do give up a lot of rushing production. As long as Alexander Mattison does not return, McCormick is a flex.
Ooh, that was good. That was less than 15 seconds. Dave, Jaleel McLaughlin.
He was the best running back for Denver before the bye. We'll see if he's the best running back for Denver after the bye. It's tough to trust any Denver running back, but he might be the best one rest of season.
Ooh, less than 10 seconds. Dave, back to you for Kamani Vidal.
Possibly in a good situation with the Chargers. I don't know if they've got anybody that can run the ball. He and Gus Edwards are kind of the same. He's just a younger version, but he was the one playing in the fourth quarter and in passing down situations against the Chiefs on Sunday.
Oh, 14 seconds. Very good. Jamie, Isaiah Davis.
Isaiah Davis was basically even with Braylon Allen, but Davis looked a little bit more explosive and got the touchdown. So both guys have the opportunity to be flex plays against the Jaguars. That's obviously contingent, though, on Breece Hall missing his second straight game with a knee injury.
We will spend more than 15 seconds on Adam Thielen. When we come back on Fantasy Football Today, we'll talk about wide receivers and tight ends that you can pick up for the first round of your fantasy playoffs after this. Two straight games with right around 100 yards for Adam Thielen, and he did it last week against the Philadelphia Eagles. It's going to be tough to leave him out of your fantasy lineups, but at the very least, get him on your team. He headlines the wide receivers. We'll also talk about some tight ends to add here. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. All right, Jamie, so you said he should be your number one priority, right, Adam Thielen? And I would say even if you don't need a wide receiver, wouldn't it be smart to just go get this guy and keep him off someone else's team?
100%. You know, he, I guess for what it's worth, you know, even though he's 31 at this point in his career, you know, the best days are behind him, but he's got fresh legs after missing all that time with the hamstring injury. And you've seen the last 2 weeks with 21 targets, 17 catches, 201 yards, and a touchdown. And like you said, one of those games was against Tampa Bay. The other was against Philadelphia. So the schedule sets up very favorably for him. You know, he gets the Cowboys this week. They're number 9 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. Then he gets Arizona, which is a little bit of a tougher matchup, but he closes the fantasy playoffs, the fantasy championship in week 17 against Tampa Bay, which he just beat up in one of those two outstanding performances. So Bryce Young is playing very well right now, and Adam Thielen's a big reason why. He has top 20 upside rest of season. We talked about two receivers who we lost confidence in going into the playoffs. I would start him over Deebo Samuel easily. I would start him over DK Metcalf. I start him over Malik Neighbors. There are a lot of receivers I would start Adam Thielen over right now, especially with this matchup against the Cowboys.
That's interesting. And I'll say this about the Cardinals matchup. If you're a little fearful of that, they actually give up the 5th most receiving yards to slot receivers this year. So it might not be a bad matchup for Adam Thielen. Dave, you can talk about him, but there was also a name that wasn't on that list that I know Jamie will be writing about in his column that we talked about on our podcast, and that's Christian Watson, who's 63% rostered. How would Christian Watson compare to Adam Thielen?
I mean, I'd rather have Thielen because I think the volume will be consistently high for Adam Thielen from week to week. And he's more than just like a 6-yard A-dot type of guy. More than half of his targets last week were on throws or 12-plus air yards. He also left Cooper DeJean in the blender on one play. That was the 24-yard catch. So his route running is great. He uses his leverage well. He's doing a lot of things that I bet the Packers wish Christian Watson was doing well. But the one thing that Christian Watson can do really well is run fast downfield. And that's something that Thielen just cannot do. And as long as Romeo Doubs is out, and that's obviously key for the Packers, you're going to continue to see Christian Watson as an every down player for Green Bay. And there won't be games like last week where they just lean on Josh Jacobs in the red zone. You're going to see some end zone targets for Christian Watson on top of the deep stuff. I think you're going to see him as a number 3 receiver as long as Doubs is out rest of season. And he would be either the second or the third guy at wide receiver that I would take off the waiver wire this week. Thielen is number 1. But if Ladd McConkey's out, I think Josh Palmer is number 2.
And to follow up on Josh Palmer, who had 6 catches for 78 yards on 9 targets at Kansas City, and he also was wide open for what should have been an 82-yard touchdown, but deep throw, those can be inaccurate, and Justin Herbert missed him. Against Tampa Bay, it's been a little bit better against receivers lately, but you keep talking about DK Metcalf, Deebo Samuel. If Ladd McConkey were out, would you start, Jamie, Josh Palmer over DK Metcalf and or Deebo?
Deebo easily, no matter what the situation is. The thing with Metcalf is if he gets in full practices, then I'll get a little bit more confident in him. I do think the knee and the shoulder injuries that have been bothering him, which kept him out of practice each of the last 2 weeks, is something to keep an eye on. Dave mentioned that. But I like the matchup for Metcalf a little bit. I do think the thing for Palmer you got to keep an eye on here is this is a situation where the Chargers, I can see it could be a Quentin Johnson game. I do agree with you. The matchup is certainly favorable, and they did lose Antoine Winfield, so hopefully that helps. Palmer, though, has been a little inconsistent even at the early part of the season before Ladd McConkey became a thing. So I just don't know if he's going to be as consistent and gain as many targets as he needs, whereas I think DK Metcalf's going to start to get fed a little bit. And I do think the one thing about the Seahawks, this could be a game because the Packers offense where they're chasing points, and maybe the targets rise a little bit for Metcalf in this week's game.
I'm going to throw Keenan Allen in this discussion just, for start-sit purposes, but Rome Odunze is someone who's 64% rostered, and now he gets the Vikings, and we saw 2 big games from Caleb Williams against Minnesota and Detroit. Those are the next 2 matchups for Chicago. So if you have Keenan Allen or if you have Rome Odunze, how do you feel about those guys, Dave, compared to some of the wide receivers we've talked about on the waiver wire?
I don't mind dialing back expectations on Keenan Allen a little bit, but I would expect a bounce back in terms of targets for him. And in the case of Allen and Odunze, and you can throw DJ Moore in that mix too, although you're not going to find him on any waiver wires, they're taking on Minnesota. And that's the team that allows a ton of PPR points to wide receivers. We saw 2 Falcons wide receivers get over 15 PPR points against Minnesota on Sunday, and one of them was not Drake London. So that's an interesting tidbit that I think could help make you trust all the Bears wide receivers this week. DJ Moore, you're still going to start with like number 2 wide receiver expectations. Allen should be a number 3 receiver, high end, especially in full PPR. And Odunze, I don't know if you can count on him to score touchdowns, and his target volume wasn't great, but he can make big plays, and the Bears will throw the ball a lot against Minnesota. So maybe if you're kind of stuck, and maybe if you miss out on Adam Thielen and you don't want to trust Watson or any other, Josh Palmer, those types of guys, Odunze would be the pivot there, and he can end up being decent.
Okay, let's go to the tight ends here. And we've got guys in shallower leagues like Pat Freiermuth, George Pickens, let's call him 50-50 at this point for this week's game. Pat Freiermuth might be a good option for you, even though he only had 3 targets against Cleveland. Zach Ertz has scored double-digit PPR fantasy points in 6 of his last 8 games, and the Saints have given up 41 or more yards to a bunch of tight ends who aren't good in their last 7 games. And then Tucker Kraft has been really good without Romeo Doubs. But here are the tight ends who are more available. Hunter Henry. Jamie, is Hunter Henry a real standout in this group when you look at Ferguson, Kincaid, et cetera? Is it clearly Hunter Henry, or is there any debate?
I think there could be some debate with Ferguson just based on the matchup. It was a little disappointing to see what he didn't do against the Bengals, given how good the matchup is. You wonder if there was maybe the shake the rust off game after being out 2 games with the concussion. But, Henry has just been so consistent from a target standpoint. He's been very consistent from a production standpoint, 12.3 PPR points in 3 of his last 5 games. He's been basically living in that 8+ target range in 3 of his last 4. So since Drake May has taken over, this has been his consistent go-to guy. We've seen Austin Hooper find the end zone a couple of times. Obviously, there's been a couple of Demario Douglas games, and there's been some other receivers who have popped up along the way for the Patriots. But he's leaned so heavily on Hunter Henry. The matchup's not exactly the most favorable the next 3 games for him. So not just including the Cardinals game, the 2 games after that. But I just think you buy into what the targets have been, what his role has been, his production has been. And so when you get past the must-start tight ends, when you start looking at basically tight ends 6 through 12, that's where he belongs. And so better than a Kyle Pitts, better than a Cole Kmet. You can make an argument better than a Tucker Kraft and even a Sam Laporta, just based on the consistency that he's shown. So that's kind of where Hunter Henry lies. So even in a tough matchup, I'm still going to start him. If he's available on waivers, I'm certainly going to look to pick him up if my tight end situation is a little bit shaky.
Okay, Dave, could you see yourself starting anyone else on this list? Ferguson, Kincaid, Juwan Johnson, Grant Calcaterra, Dalton Schultz, who has really good matchups coming up, by the way. Could you see yourself starting anyone this week?
The only other one is Ferguson. That's it. And it's based on the idea that he's going to continue to see 6+ targets. That's always the number that I look for when I start a fantasy tight end. I want somebody that's going to lock in at least 6 targets. I think Ferguson can do that. He did do that on Monday against Cincinnati. Jamie's right. I don't know why he didn't get more targets. And I don't know why he didn't do better than he did on the 6 targets that he had, but I would still trust that Dallas will find a way to get him the football more as they move forward.
I will say this, just to Dave's point about the targets. Juwan Johnson's got 15 targets in his last 2 games. We know this situation is not great without Derek Carr there, but he's probably going to get fed in a good matchup against Washington. The schedule's favorable rest of the way. So while it's a little bit tough to trust, he is going to get those opportunities just based on how bad the receiving core is for New Orleans right now.
I think I would rather have Dalton Schultz than Juwan Johnson. How about you?
And look, Schultz is coming off last time we saw him, his best game that we had all season against the Jaguars in Week 13. Great matchup against Miami. Actually, great schedule rest of the way. So those 2 guys, I think, are in very similar situations. And if you want to just trust the quarterback for Schultz, that's certainly an easy way to go.
Yeah, if Derek Carr somehow plays, he hasn't been ruled out. If he somehow plays, then I would rather have Juwan Johnson. Dalton Schultz has scored 8.3 or more PPR fantasy points in 4 of his last 6 games, and 2 of 3 since Nico Collins returned from injury. And guess what? It's time for some Who Has More, so don't go anywhere. When we come back, it's one of America's kind of sort of buzzing about game shows about fantasy football, and we'll do it after this on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. It is time for America's 15th favorite fantasy football game show. It is time for Who Has More? And yes, unfortunately, we have fallen in the rankings. We haven't been here for 2 straight weeks we missed. We can't expect to be a top 5, top 10 fantasy football game show with all the competition out there if we miss 2 weeks. But there's time to catch up and make up for lost time. We're going to start right now with Who Has More. Here's how the game works. I read from my notes. Dave and Jamie answer. We all have a good time. Who has more receiving yards? Drake London in the first 13 games of 2023? Or Drake London in the first 13 games of 2024. And I should say his first 13 games, because last year he missed 1 game. Drake London last year or this year through 13 games?
I'll say this year.
I will also say this year.
You are both correct. 866 to 769. But really not having that big Kirk Cousins bump that we were...
Yeah.
Somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle. He's obviously gotten the bump.
I feel like there were too many games this year where he didn't get the target volume that we wanted him or that we expected him to have. And in the games where he did get good target volume, he was fine. But I really wish the Falcons had done more to get double-digit targets on his hands every single week. And if he had done that, then yes, he would be like a slam. He'd be up there as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. We'd never have questions about him. Everybody would be thrilled with Drake London.
I think he was rolling along before that Broncos game. And the Broncos game, the last game, Cousins has been struggling. He needs touchdowns. And Cousins hasn't thrown a touchdown in 4 straight games. So that's a big part of it.
All right, who has more touchdown passes this season?
Not Kirk Cousins.
The Giants backup quarterbacks or the Dolphins backup quarterbacks?
Oh, that's
Is
rough.
Daniel Jones considered a backup quarterback?
No, not yet.
The Dolphins' backup quarterback.
I think it might actually be the Giants. No, because they didn't have one last week. I'll say the Dolphins' backup quarterbacks.
It is the Dolphins by a tally of 1-0. The Giants' backup quarterbacks have not thrown one yet. The Dolphins guys threw one. Who has more rushes of more than 15 yards? Zach Charbonnet in the first 28 games of his career, or Zach Charbonnet in Week 14?
I mean, I'm going to play the
Charbonnet
odds and
week
say
14.
I'll play the odds and say Zach Charbonnet in the first 28 games of his career.
And Jamie, you said?
Week 14.
And the answer is the first 28 games of his career, 4-3. He had
What are the numbers on that, Adam?
He had 4 carries of 15 or more yards in the first 28 games of his career. He had 3 of them last week.
I would have guessed that both of those numbers would have been higher. It's so you're telling me he has like 7 total over the course of his career, and I know that Zach Charbonnet hasn't played every single game of his career, but I'm surprised by the number there. I thought it would have been higher.
You would think so, but he doesn't do it very often, so that's why Week 14 was such an outlier. All right, who has more catches, Jaleel McLaughlin or Jonathan Taylor?
I believe it's McLaughlin.
I'll go Taylor just to be different.
Uh-oh, Dave's pulling away. He takes a 2-0 lead. It is Jaleel McLaughlin, 17-14. And I just wanted to bring that up because McLaughlin is someone that you might want to pick up off waivers if you really need a running back right now. But he just never catches the ball, which is weird. He had 5 catches in Week 1. He has 12 since then. Okay, moving on.
If you go catches per game, though, Taylor wins because he missed time.
Catches per game. Yeah, but I didn't say that. So I make.
I know.
Remember, I read from my notes. That's how the.
It's funny though. You mentioned we were off for 2 weeks. I did. Everybody's making a big deal about the banner that flew over the Giants game. That calling for the firing of the guys. Right behind them was another banner saying, "Where's we have more? We miss it."
Well, they said, "Who has more?" Not we have more. Oh man.
You don't even know what game show you're on. That's okay. I didn't know who my player who I liked was earlier in the show.
Jamie, we have more is not even a top 20 fantasy football game show. Come on. All right, who has more scrimmage yards? Alvin Kamara or Jamar Chase?
I think it's Chase. I'll say Chase.
I'll say Chase also.
Oh, what an opportunity for Jamie. It's actually Alvin Kamara.
It is Kamara.
Kamara has about 80 more scrimmage yards. I heard on the broadcast he's the only player that leads his team in rushing and receiving. So I don't know if that's still true, but probably is. Next up, who has more receiving yards in their last 3 games? Okay. Jordan Addison or Puka Nacua?
Puka.
I think it's Puka. I don't, I want to give Jamie a chance to jump back in, but I think Puka's the right answer.
Well, you helped him out because Addison's the right answer, so it would have been game over.
No.
Addison has 14 more yards. This is just for fun bonus. Who has the most yards in their last 3 games? These guys are top 4, but somebody has more than Jordan Addison, more receiving yards in his last 3 games.
Is it Chase?
Jerry Jeudy.
Oh, yeah, him.
Oh, yeah.
All right, who has more rushing yards in their last 3 games?
Okay.
Derrick Henry or Rico Dowdle?
Dowdle.
Last 3 games or last 3 weeks?
Games.
Dowdle.
It is Rico Dowdle, and not even really that close. 329 rushing yards for Dowdle, 287 for Derrick Henry. And finally,
well, hold on a second. Who do you think will have more rushing yards after their last 4 games? Because Derrick Henry has the Giants this week. That could be 150 yards, no problem for King Henry.
Who does Dowdle have? Panthers.
Right?
Yeah, it's true. He might.
I'm going to go Henry, though. I'm going to guess Henry. And then the last one, I'm going to give you the option for a tie, just to throw that in there, just to make you think. Who has more Super Bowls, the NFC or the AFC? Super Bowl wins.
NFC.
AFC.
Oh, you're both wrong. It's a tie. 29-29. This is really cool. You go through Super Bowl history. The AFC was crushing it until like the 80s and 90s when you had a stretch of something like 12 straight NFC champions. You know, you had the Bills losing all those games. You had the Bears, the Giants, 49ers, you had the Cowboys, all that. But it's 29-29 going into this year's Super Bowl 59. Good job, guys. Congratulations. I feel like we're going to be moving up the rankings. We'll let you know next week on who has more. We're also going to find out what you're asking about. We'll read your tweets, your waiver wire questions when we come back on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM, the sportsbook born in Vegas. We're going to read your tweets now. And by the way, you can follow us on Twitter at Adam Azer, at Dave Richard, and at Jamie Eisenberg. People have said that we have some of the most creative Twitter handles out there. Here's our first tweet. Is from Jim. He has the first waiver priority and a bye. What defenses should I try to grab for weeks 16 and 17?
I would start with the Falcons, who take on the Giants in week 16, and the Colts, who take on the Giants in week 17.
That's mean, Dave.
Mean, but I want Jim to win his fantasy league. This is a good start.
I like the Packers against the Saints next week.
Sure.
Let's just see who would you rather have the Packers or the Saints? Or the Packers against the Saints or the Falcons against the Giants next week? Next week.
I will take the Falcons now because I know what that Giants offense will look like. I can't say for sure that the Saints offense is going to be pathetic. It just depends who their quarterback is going to be moving forward.
All right, let's get to our next tweet from Jason. Oh, he's got all the Jets. Would you drop Braylon Allen or Isaiah Davis for Patrick Taylor, Sincere McCormick, or Sean Tucker in half PPR?
No. Maybe, I guess maybe one of them. Yeah, I'd certainly not dropping Breece Hall. I probably would hold on to Braylon Allen and drop Isaiah Davis.
Yeah, absolutely. Davis for Taylor would make some sense. It wouldn't be wrong to drop Allen either because Davis is the one that had all of their snaps inside the 10-yard line last week for the Jets. But once Breece Hall comes back, I don't think anybody's starting Allen or Davis. We just don't know if/when Hall is coming back.
Our next tweet is from Jay. I need a wide receiver flyer for week 15. Who's a high-risk, high-reward wide receiver in week 15?
Well, if you can't get your hands on Adam Thielen, I would start the week with Josh Palmer because if he's in that exact same situation, and let's not forget, not only was Ladd McConkey out, but Will Dissly got hurt in the game for the Chargers. So really, it caused the targets to really kind of funnel closer to the wide receivers. I know Stone Smart made a couple of decent plays, but Palmer is going to be where I would start for a wide receiver to grab off the waiver wire who's got some high risk and high reward.
Our next question comes from Aldi's Tomatoes. Is Hurts worth benching in the playoffs for the red-hot Sam Darnold?
I would do that this week. I'd start Darnold over Hurts for their respective matchups in week 15. So it's tough to do that because Jalen Hurts has been so special, but Sam Darnold's been just as good, certainly playing at a very high level coming into this matchup against Chicago.
All right, and I actually see Dave responded to that and said, yes, he would also do that.
I would.
Okay, next one is from The Chosen One. Would you be concerned about playing Alvin Kamara?
Concerned?
Yeah.
Sure. Does it mean I'm going to sit him? I better have some really good running backs to replace Alvin Kamara with.
Next one and our last one. I'm sorry. Our last one here. Do I start Jordan Addison over Drake London in the fantasy playoffs?
Yeah.
I wouldn't do that this week against the Raiders.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say yes to that. But in non-PPR or half PPR, I think I would because London's got the Raiders, but Addison has the Bears.
Yeah, Addison's looking very good right now, and he just had a big game against the Bears, as I recall, right? Just a couple of weeks ago. So we will see. I guess we're pretty high on the Vikings passing game. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. That's going to do it for Fantasy Football Today. If you need more help, you can check out the Fantasy Football Today podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. We are back tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern on CBS Sports Network. Thanks to Dave and Jamie. I'm Adam. We'll see you next time.